With the beginning of the 18th century, the sun begins to set on the great Islamic empires. Part of the decline can be attributed to the limits of personal monarchic rule. Where the monarch is the most important factor in the success of the state, then the health and competency of the monarch is paramount. But that's not the only factor in the weakening of these empires. Religious strife, particularly in Mughal India, but also within the Ottoman and Safavid empires, plays a major role. Tensions were increasing between more conservative and more liberal elements of society, as we've seen in the example of the reception of coffee and tobacco. While it might seem trivial on the surface, it isn't. The conflict reflects a fundamental distrust of the outside world, a wariness of change, and an aversion to scientific discovery and technological innovation. In many ways, the Islamic empires begin to look inward, renouncing worldliness and embracing tribal traditions and values instead. It's also important to remember that the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal civilizations, while Islamic, are not Arab. They are Turk, Persian, and Indian, respectively, with Arabs as subjects, but not as rulers. As you might suspect, there was ample cause for resentment of their rulers among the indigenous Arab populations. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, a religious movement known as Wahhabism emerged in the 18th century, a very conservative, strict form of Sunni Islam practiced to this day in Saudi Arabia. The Wahhabists reviled the Ottomans, whom they deemed religiously degenerate and insufficiently observant of the word of Scripture, the Quran. Religious dissent festered throughout the Islamic kingdoms. Safavid Shiites began to persecute non-Shiites and eventually make war against them, sometimes with disastrous consequences, as when Shia Islam was overrun by Sunni Afghans in 1722. In the Mughal state, the religious persecution of Hindus, the execution of Sufi and Sikh holy men, and the practice of forced conversion to Islam was taken to new heights under the Emperor Aurangzeb. Amid this religious antagonism, the European trading companies began to exert more authority and control over their networks, effectively monopolizing most of the commerce that had financed the gunpowder empires. As a consequence, an important source of funding was siphoned away from the Islamic empires, which had been economically drained by years of unproductive and costly warfare. Finally, the military prowess that would have enabled these Islamic societies to continue their rule began to dissipate. By the 18th century, the Europeans had moved to the forefront in military technology. Their ability to develop and deploy advanced weaponry was growing faster than the ability of the Islamic states, and in particular the Ottomans, to purchase it. The Turks bought their weaponry from the West, and their military decline leads to a shift in the balance of power. By the dawn of the 19th century, the borders of the once mighty Ottoman Empire began to shrink, and its vaunted military fearsomeness, so eloquently voiced by the diplomat Buzbek, seemed a distant echo. The relationship between the Muslim empires and the Europeans evolved in interesting ways. Europeans were attracted to the study of Islamic culture both for commercial purposes as well as for Christian proselytizing, where they were seldom successful. The Muslim empires, on the other hand, are much less interested in the European world. This is a pattern that we'll see in China, and to a slightly lesser extent, we also see it here. The result is what we might term a technological deficit. Here's an example. One of the most significant innovations that Spanish Jews brought to the Ottoman Empire was the printing press. In 1493, a year after their expulsion from Spain, the Namias family established the first printing press in Istanbul. They developed a thriving business printing books in Hebrew. Printing books in Turkish or Arabic was forbidden until the 18th century. Why? Because it's new, because it might change the established order, and therefore it must be treated as a threat. We can finish with the same questions that we will ask about China. What's the price of stability? What's the cost of keeping things as they are and avoiding innovation? What price is exacted when a society or a civilization refuses to change? Is this a path to prosperity or a road to ruin? Your instructor will be very interested in hearing your thoughts. Until next time, best wishes.